Hi everyone, Mrs. Bilo here. In this video, I'm going to be going over the modern genetics notes, specifically on sex-linked inheritance and sex-linked traits, which is slides 16 to 22. So remember, this is a karyotype for a human. So there are a total of 46 chromosomes, or you could say that we have 23 pairs. The first 22 pairs are what we call the autosomes. So these are the autosomes. These are things that code for most of the things we've been talking about in your body. Things like hair color, eye color, skin color, things like that. Versus the sex chromosomes, these are the last pair of chromosomes, and they obviously code for sex, so male or female. This one is a male because we see XY versus females are XX. And we're going to be talking about genes or traits that are specifically found on these chromosomes. Because in comparison, we've been talking about genes or traits that are found on the other chromosomes. So like I said, most traits we have discussed so far have been on the autosomes. Now we're going to look at traits that are sex-linked, meaning they are an allele or a gene that is on the sex chromosomes, whether it's one sex chromosome or both. Now, remember that the X chromosome, which is shown here as in a picture, is bigger than the Y chromosome. So we can see that here, okay, that this is definitely a male because I don't see two X chromosomes that are the same size, but rather I see an X and a Y chromosome. So since the X chromosome is bigger, there are more X-linked traits than there are Y-linked traits, simply because it's bigger. So typically we tend to study X-linked traits more just because there's more genes to study on it, and we can find X chromosomes in both males and females, versus the Y chromosomes are just found in males. So most of what we're talking about in this unit will be X-linked traits, so traits that are found in the X chromosome, but that's not to say there can't be traits that are found on the Y chromosome. Now remember, males only have one X chromosome. So they can be sometimes affected more by certain types of traits that are found on that chromosome. So for example, we're going to talk about color blindness, specifically red-green, because there's also blue-yellow, but the red-green ones specifically, that type of color blindness is typically found in males more than females, which we're going to talk about why. And then also hemophilia, which is a blood disorder, which can be found also more in males than females. And hemophilia in this blood disorder, most people, when you get a cut on like your skin, for example, the blood will start to clot, so you stop bleeding. Both of these, by the way, are things that deal with some type of mutation that causes a disease. Color blindness obviously being the inability to see and perceive certain colors. Hemophilia being there is a mutation on the chromosome that actually affects the clotting factors in your blood. So people who have hemophilia, their blood doesn't clot properly, which can be very dangerous, and it could cause them to keep bleeding. There are medications out there that people can take that have this disease, so they are able to live a more normal life and be more safe. So let's talk about color blindness. Let me just fix this. This is a lowercase b. Okay, so color blindness is found on the X chromosome, so we could call it X-linked. And most importantly, it is a recessive trait. So you can have a couple different things. You can have things that are X-linked and recessive, like what we're going to talk about here. You can have things that are X-linked and dominant, which we'll talk about in a second. And then we're not going to talk about examples of these, but there will be questions on them. You could talk about Y-linked recessive traits and Y-linked dominant traits. However, these would only affect males versus the X could potentially affect males and females. And so we're going back to talking about typical Mendelian traits where there's a dominant and recessive trait. So in this example, we're going to use the letter B for color blindness. So since it is a recessive trait, we're going to use the little lowercase b to represent that. Now, in a male, it tends to be more frequent because a male would only need to receive one recessive allele in order to display the trait. So this is a colorblind male. As long as he has that one recessive allele, the trait for colorblindness, he will be colorblind. Versus females would need to get 2 copies because they have 2 X chromosomes. Remember, this is X-linked, so it is found on the X chromosome. So a female would have to get both copies, both recessive alleles, in order to display the trait, and the chances of that happening are less likely. Females who are heterozygous, so capital letter and a lowercase letter, are what we call carriers. So they are carrying the trait, but they themselves are not colorblind. So that's how you can have a son who is colorblind when both parents are not colorblind. Because if the mom is carrying that trait and she passes it on to her son, then he could be colorblind. So here's an example. So red-green colorblindness, this is the one that is X-linked. Blue-yellow, this is actually not sex-linked at all because this trait is related to the autosomes. So for example, if you had red-green colorblindness, both of these pictures would look the same to you. Okay. So it affects in your eye, you have these things called rods and cones that help you to perceive things. And cones are the things that help you to perceive color. And in color blindness, there's a mutation on one of those, which causes color blindness. Some other organisms that also have sex-linked traits are fruit flies, which have been heavily studied by scientists for their genetics because they're easy to work with, and they reproduce a lot of offspring, and they've been used in quite a few genetic studies. And in fruit flies, there are red eyes and there are white eyes, the white eye being recessive. And these are also X-linked and recessive traits as well. So the white eye, like color blindness, is linked to the X chromosome. It's on the X chromosome, and it's also recessive. So again, the males are more likely to have the white eyes because as long as the male gets that one copy of that recessive trait, he will display that recessive trait, which in this case is white eyes. Versus in order for a female to have the white eyes, she would have to get both lowercase letters. So the male, her father would have to be have white eyes to give this to her. And then her mother would have to have white eyes or be a carrier to give this to her. Because remember, parents only pass on one of those alleles to their offspring. So a female is always going to pass on the X's. It just depends what she's carrying on those. And then a male can pass on an X or a Y. Let's talk about an example of a sex-linked trait, an X-linked trait. So again, found on the X chromosome that is dominant. Okay. So this is a specific type of disease that affects the skin. It can cause blisters, other medical issues, and it is a dominant trait. So let's say we have a mother who has that trait. So we'll say that she is, because we're representing it different here. So let's say that she's like X. We'll use the letter, letter D for this, okay? So she has the trait and the dad doesn't have the trait. So he would be a lowercase d and a lowercase y and a y. So again, I said that this trait is dominant. So as long as you have that capital letter, you will have the trait. And so this, if it's dominant, it would actually affect males and females equally. Because as long as you get that allele, you're going to display it no matter what. Because this female is obviously displaying it. And then if a male had it, he would display it. So this mom, there's a 50-50 chance she will pass this on. So it'd be a 50-50 chance her kid would have that disease. Now, unfortunately, if a male gets it, so like this male right here, so he ends up getting that from his mom, this actually ends up being lethal in males. So this actually would lead in a miscarriage, and that child just wouldn't come to be because the mutation is so lethal. There also wouldn't be females out there that would have 2 of these. That would also be too lethal as well. The mutation would just be so severe that it would just lead in a miscarriage to begin with. So an X-linked dominant trait would affect males and females equally. But an X-linked recessive trait would be more likely to affect males because females would need 2 copies to display the recessive trait. Versus if you have the capital letter, the dominant trait, you're going to display that trait no matter what. All right, so let's go back to our color blindness example. So again, color blindness is X-linked, so it's on the X chromosome and it is recessive. So let's say we have a female, so mom, a woman who is a carrier. So she would be XX because she's a female, and she's carrying the trait, but she's not colorblind. Remember, color blindness is recessive. So she's carrying that trait, but then she has the dominant trait to cover that up. So she's not colorblind, but she's carrying the recessive trait for color blindness. And then let's say we have a male who is normal. So he is XY and he is normal. So he is not colorblind. So he's going to have a capital B because remember, color blindness is recessive. And then we're going to go ahead and do the cross. So this also explains why it's a 50-50 chance of when someone's pregnant, they're going to have a boy or a girl. Because again, you get 1 allele from each parent or 1 chromosome from each parent because of the law of segregation. And so these would be females because the dad would be passing on his X and mom's going to pass on an X no matter what. Versus these would be boys because the father is giving the Y to make that a baby boy. Now, we have 3 questions here about the children. So out of the 4 children, because it's asking about the child, so out of the 4, how many of them would be colorblind? So this is the only one that would be colorblind. So that'd be a 1 out of 4 or a 25% chance they would have a colorblind child. Versus if we're just talking about the daughters, there are 2 daughters here and neither of them are colorblind because they would have to have both lowercase b's in order to be colorblind. So that'd be a 0 out of 2 or a 0% chance. And then if we're looking at the 2 boys, one of them has a chance to be colorblind because he has that lowercase b. So that would be a 1 out of 2 chance or a 50% chance of having a son who is colorblind. So if you're asked a question about that, make sure you're paying attention to if the question is about all of the children, just the daughters, which there's 2 of, or just the sons, which there's 2 of.